So we might say that narrative is simply a string of events in which one thing happens after another. We can call it just bare chronology. I went to the store, I bought some eggs, I brought them home, I ate the eggs. This is an example of parataxis. It's a fancy word for talking about stringing sentences together with no conjunctions between them, or maybe the conjunction and. That's how life feels. Life feels to me paratactical. The etc. of the everyday. And this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Now, certainly, for our writing to be dynamic, we need to be able to capture uh, the motion of time. But writing attempts, literary writing attempts, to turn this narrative into story. That's the distinction I'm going to make here. Uh, Narrative is simply, again, that happened, that happened, that happened, that happened. Whereas a story shapes that chronological flow into a structure that has a discernible beginning, middle, and end, but also a structure that puts into play conflicts, tensions, frictions. And it's this conflict, friction, tension that ultimately gives the story its energy. It gives the story its magnetism, I should rather say. It's the conflict that pulls us in. So I want to talk for a minute about obvious ways of imagining tension, and then maybe less obvious ways of imagining tension. The obvious ways of imagining tension in a story are what I will call physical tensions. The most obvious tension in a story, be it fiction or nonfiction, is between protagonist and antagonist. A main character who is aspiring to do something and a character that opposes the main character, trying to block that main character for doing something. But also, another way that physical tension is sometimes created in a story is through a conflict between self and environment. If I'm writing a nature essay, for instance, I, as a human consciousness, would be in the essay, and my opponent, let's say, could be any sort of natural environment. So the conflict between self and nature would be the physical tension that would make such a story attractive. There are less obvious ways to create tension, though, and these are not what I would call tensions of content, which I've just described. Content being, say, two characters battling, or content being, say, the writer battling with a natural environment. These are tensions generated by form. I'll call these formal tensions. And I'm not saying that these tensions are more effective than the content tensions, but they're definitely worth exploring. You have these more formal tensions as tools at your disposal, and certainly they're not opposed to content tension. A story with a very clearly delineated protagonist and antagonist can also benefit from these more formal tensions that I'm going to now talk about. So I would say one way to think about creating formal tension is through the positioning of your I, the positioning of your persona, your writerly I. We talked about this on Thursday in listening to the two versions of Big River, where we agreed that the Johnny Cash version suggests that the singer is somehow extremely close to the material. There's an emotional investment in the way Cash sings the song. There's a presence in the way he sings the song that suggests that his eye is positioned very close to the music, to the lyrics. And of course that would make sense since he wrote the song. But then we talked about how in the Dillon/Band version, Dillon and the Band in the Basement Tapes, how Dillon seems not to be so close. There's a kind of floatingness to his voice. There's not that sense of commitment that we feel in the Cash. So his eye is positioned further away from the material. So one way you can create tension in a memoir is to move your eye back and forth between closeness and distance. So you can describe an event very close up with raw immediacy. But then you might step back and reflect upon that event from say, a more mature stance. Often this kind of interplay between closeness and distance can occur in a memoir that depicts a memory from a child's point of view, your point of view as a child, and then pulls back and can look at the same experience from a more adult point of view. So, positioning of the eye, close, far. Another way to think about formal tension, and this is connected to the first, is to move back and forth between personal and collective. It's a common strategy in memoir where a person might write about a very visceral experience that happened only to him or her, like, say, addiction, maybe an essay about alcoholism, about my alcoholism or the alcoholism of one of my parents, say. And I can write about that, but then I can like zoom out and say, well, how does alcoholism look to science? How does alcoholism look to certain forms of Christianity? How is alcoholism depicted in film? So you see, you can have this interplay between individual and collective, another way of creating tension. You can also think about inside versus outside. You might imagine writing about your interiors in a way that approaches stream of consciousness, that captures the idiosyncrasy, the strangeness of your deep interiors, but then imagine how you look from the point of view of somebody else. That can create a really interesting tension between how you see yourself and how you imagine someone else seeing yourself. So inside versus outside. Another way to create tension formally, and this one is especially interesting, I think, is full space, empty space. What does that mean? You can use the blank space of the page in a meaningful fashion. So perhaps you want to write a kind of aphoristic essay where you sentences or very short paragraphs divided by lots of blank space. When you do that, the blank space itself takes on meaning, and there can be a tension there between what shows up as print and the blankness in between what shows up at print. What's going on with that? Why did the writer decide to leave such wide blank spaces? Again, another kind of tension. And another final kind of formal tension that I'll talk about here, there are many others, is to use a non-literary form or a traditionally non-literary form in a literary context. So maybe you want to write an essay made up of a grocery list. Or maybe you want to write an essay in the form of a how-to, make a pie, say. Maybe you want to write an essay in the form of a syllabus. That's been done. So that tension there is between the non-literary, traditionally, and the literary. And so suddenly I'm reading, well, this is just an ordinary grocery list, but whoa, there are these connections and they're in here that suggest this is far more than a grocery list. So these are just some techniques to think about as you begin drafting your memoirs. I really want to encourage you to be stylistically, formally experimental, and we'll be reading essays in this more kind of experimental mode as the semester goes on.